Today we're talking about one of the most divisive topics when it comes to personal finance, and that is the FIRE movement. For every article and video you see talking about how incredible FIRE is and how you can retire in your 30s and 40s, you'll see a video of an article talking about how it's unrealistic or why they stopped following the FIRE movement. Today we're going to be talking about the FIRE movement as a whole and break it down into three main parts. Part one, we're going to talk about what you'll need to figure out when you're going to retire. We're going to talk about some of the numbers and some of the goals you'll need to reach for the FIRE movement to be realistic for you. Part two, we're going to talk about some of the things that you need to consider. These are the variables that could change your situation significantly by the time you decide to retire. And then part three, I'm going to finish off giving my thoughts on the FIRE movement as a whole. This is where I'm going to give my thoughts on, is this realistic? Who can benefit from it? And just kind of my thoughts of the people that are involved in the FIRE movement. So let me know in the comments down below if you've ever considered using the FIRE movement and what are some of the things that really drew you in or pushed you away from it as a whole. So for those of you who don't know, the FIRE movement stands for Financial Independence, Retire Early. And it's this idea of aggressively saving now and hopefully being able to retire in the next 10 years in your 30s and 40s. And it's really exciting for people that are in a job that they don't love or just the idea that they don't want to work forever. When you look at some of the numbers, 30% of people absolutely hate their job and they don't feel fulfilled by it. And I don't think that's surprising based off of some of the statistics and kind of the overall feelings that we've been seeing, especially as 2020 pushed people from working from home. And now as people are getting pushed back to working in the office, you're seeing a lot of unhappiness when it comes to jobs. And in the FIRE movement, there's a bunch of different variations depending on how you want to live your life. You have the traditional FIRE movement, which is the idea of saving 50% of your income for the next 10 years to hopefully retire early. You have the lean FIRE movement, which is the idea of living incredibly frugally so that your expenses are not going to need to be as much, and as a result, your investments are not going to be as large as it would be for some of the traditional or some of the fat FIRE movements. And then you have what I think is the most interesting, which is the barista FIRE, which is the idea of working part-time. The barista comes from a lot of people talking about working at Starbucks because of the flexibility and the health benefits, but it's the idea of being more flexible with your schedule, working when you want to, but still having some income so you don't need to entirely rely on your investments to live for the next 40 plus years. All right, let's talk about part one, which is going to be, what do you need to retire? Retirement is something that a lot of people haven't really thought of. People have retirement accounts, they throw money into it, they invest into it, but they haven't really figured out how much money that they're going to actually need to retire. The general rules that people use looking in the FIRE movement is the 4% withdrawal rule. This is the idea that every year to successfully be able to retire, you're going to be removing at maximum 4% of your total investments. The whole idea is that if you're using a number that's above that, you're going to be draining your cash reserves too fast. So by the time you get into your 60s, 70s, and 80s, you're not going to have enough money to survive on. So it's this healthy withdrawal rate, which is the 4% that most people tend to use as the sweet spot. Using this 4% withdrawal rate, it comes with the idea that you'll need to have 25 times your annual expenses to be able to retire comfortably. And so looking at my current expenses and assuming I spend around 70% of my income, we'll call that around $31,000 a year of my annual expenses, times 25, that means I would need just under $790,000 to retire comfortably. So when I use this rule, it's assuming that you're going to be retired for 30 years, which the FIRE movement, the whole idea is retire early, so you're going to need more money than that. When you look at some of the retirement calculators, assuming that I'm saving 25% of my income, which I think is a great number for people to be targeting, and saving it for the next 40 years, I'm going to be able to retire comfortably, and that's the goal. But if you change it to retiring at 45, I'm not even going to be close to where I'm going to need. So how are we going to move some of the numbers around so that we can retire early? Growing an investing portfolio has three major factors, and some of them are going to be stuff that we can affect, and some of them we are not going to be able to touch. One of the most important things when it comes to investing is time. The longer you have your money sitting in the market, the more flexibility and more growth opportunities that you're going to be able to have. This is why if you go into a calculator for compounding growth, the difference between 40 years and 45 years is pretty significant, because by the time you're getting up to your 45th, 46th years, that money is much larger and it is increasing at a significant rate. It's the idea of the dividend snowball that while it starts slow, the longer and longer it goes, it's going to be picking up steam, and by the time you're in your 40s, 50s, and 60s, you're making tens of thousands, maybe even hundreds of thousands of dollars, so that you're able to increase your investing portfolio significantly. So for this situation, time is not going to be on our side, so we're not going to be able to use that to our benefit. Next up, we have our rate of returns. The rule of 72 is a general rule that you can use to see how long it's going to take for you to double your money using normal investments. So the way that you use it is you put 72 over your percentage returns, and that gives you approximately how many years it's going to take to double your money. So if you're trying to retire early, you might think, okay, we're just going to try to maximize our returns in the short term so that we can retire as soon as possible. Yeah, let's not do that. The whole reason that this is a bad idea is that the larger returns that you're going for, the higher risks that you're taking on. And in a situation like this, where we're trying to retire in the next 10 years, a mistake or the stock market going down significantly is going to put you back so far, especially considering the amount of returns that you would need to get back to where you were. I don't think that the risk of taking on this additional potential of making 15% compared to 10% is going to be worth it in the long term. When we're in the long term, we're able to use a long-term return average of 10%, because this is an average. It's going to, on average, go back to this number. But in the next 10 years, that might not be an average. If we have a long-term recession and things are tough for the next 2 or 3 years, we may not hit our investment goals of 10% a year. So you really need to kind of assume kind of conservative, just so that by the time we get 10 years from now and you're trying to retire, that you didn't drastically overestimate how much money you're going to be making in the stock market. And so we're not going to be touching our rate of return for these equations. So what do we have on our side? The two things that we have remaining are our income and our savings rate, and that is the biggest focus of the FIRE movement. Most people, when talking about the FIRE movement, is that you're going to need to save at least 50% of your income and try to take on some additional projects, whether it be side hustles, whether it be working additional hours at your job or picking up a side job. It's the idea of using your time now to benefit significantly on the long run. The bigger shovel that you can have to dig your investment hole, you're trying to make this big hole full of money, the bigger shovel that you can have, which is by increasing your income, is going to be the biggest way that you're able to retire early. And so you can take on these additional jobs, you can save as much as possible. Some people talk about the frugal FIRE movement, which is the idea of lowering your expenses so that you're not going to need as much to retire. During this time, people are talking about hunkering down, not spending as much money, not going on vacations, just to make sure that you can increase your savings rate as much as possible. I talk about my goal savings rate as being 25%. People are talking about 50 to 75% as being the goal to make this actually work. And by increasing your income, whether it be at your job, picking up side hustles, is going to be the best way to actually make this a realistic option. All right, so we talked about what you're going to need to retire. Let's talk about some important variables that you're going to have to consider to make this go hopefully smoothly. The biggest thing that goes along with retiring early is that there are so many variables that can affect your actual retirement. The idea of retiring at a normal age means that you're going to have around 30 years. As the expected life expectancy goes up, we're going to need more and more money. So the earlier that you retire, the more money and the more years that you're going to need to be able to live off of. And so as technology improves and healthcare improves, you might need additional 5+ years of money to live off of. So that's something important to think of. But right now, the thing that you talk about, that you see in every news article when it comes to the market, is inflation. Inflation is the rate that your buying power decreases. As that number increases, your buying power goes down. And so a lot of the financial calculators that you use for the FIRE movement use 3% as the general rule of inflation. Right now it's sitting at, 7.1% for the past year? So that means that if this continues for a long time, your money is going to be less valuable than it was a year ago. So this is something that you're going to need to take into account. So if inflation stays as high, you're going to need more money because your money is not going to be as valuable, 10, 15, 20 years down the line as you may have expected. Market conditions are a huge player when it comes to retiring early, because for someone like myself that is hoping to retire at a normal age of around 65, if the market goes down for the next 1 or 2 years, I'm pretty excited. I'm buying aggressively because these are stocks I'm hoping to hold for the next 40, 50, 60 years. That's fantastic. If you're trying to retire in the next 10 years, these market conditions can really hamper how quickly you're able to retire. If things stay this low for the next 2 years and you're not able to get that hopeful 10% a year returns, you're going to be really far behind your investing goals. So the market conditions play a huge factor in not only how long it's going to take for you to hit your goals to be able to retire, but if market conditions slide, in the next 10 years and we have a really long recession, that might mean that you have to go back into the workforce. So the longer you're retired for, the more risk there is that you're going to have to go back to work because market conditions, inflation, your life situation changes to the point where you can no longer afford to not work. And the final thing I wanted to talk about that you'll need to consider is where you put your funds. For someone like myself who is planning to retire at a normal age of around 65, Roth funds are incredibly attractive to me right now because this allows my money to grow tax-free for the next 40 years. So when I take it out, I could have, $60,000 worth of contributions that result in, $1 million. And that $1 million is not going to be taxed. But if you're going to be retiring at 35 and you're going to need to draw 4% of that money annually, there are penalties associated with taking money out of a retirement account. You have stuff where the earliest you can touch it without being hit with a penalty is 59.5, and then you have the required minimum distributions at 72. 72 is a long way away when you're trying to retire at 35. So you're going to need to consider where you're going to put your money and then the tax implications that are going to go along with that. If you have all of your money in a traditional brokerage account, you have the flexibility of being able to access it whenever you want. But that also means that if you have to take your money out, you're going to have to pay taxes on it. And that sucks, especially when you're trying to plan for the future. 40 years of paying taxes on your investments, that's a little tough. So you might need to invest more than you actually think because you're actually going to have a tax bill. And it's very important to probably talk to a tax professional to try to plan this out in a way that's going to minimize your tax bill for the long term. All right, let's finish up this video with part 3, talking about my thoughts on the FIRE movement. Is it actually possible to do? Yeah, I'll say if you really wanted to do this, you could absolutely do this. We've seen people make these changes, major life changes, like living in a van to try to lower their expenses and increase flexibility. If that's something that you want to do, that's fantastic. There is the ability to save for the next 10, 15 years and be able to retire whenever you want. But I do think there are a lot of negatives associated with it, especially with the psychology that goes along with it. Back when I was in college, I was so focused on trying to invest and save for the future that I really did not have as good of a time as I should have had. So I'm worried that people are going to get into this movement, spend all of their time and effort trying to save as much money as possible, and not be able to actually enjoy their younger years. I'm sure people in their 50s and 60s really wish that they were able to go back to their 20s and 30s and be able to experience a lot of the positive opportunities that you have as being a young person. So you have the ability to use all this time to save for the future, but you also are trying to take advantage of it. And I think personally for myself, if I was trying to save as much as possible, I would not be in a great spot mentally, because I'm the type of person that obsesses over saving every dollar if possible. And if I'm going out and, I'm spending an extra $10 on gas instead of driving an extra 20 minutes to find a cheaper gas station, I might sit there and stress over that. And I think that it puts you into a spot where you're so focused on saving as much as possible that it's going to be negatively impacting your mental health. Next, we're going to talk about health insurance. In the United States, health insurance for the most part is paid for by your employer and is tied to your employment. And if you're trying to retire early, you're going to have to be paying for your insurance. Sure, there are some social programs where if your income is under a certain amount, you may be able to get it significantly paid for by the government. But some of these numbers that I found, what percentage of health insurance is paid by employers? Employees pay on average around 17% of their self-health insurance. So if you're retiring early, you're going to have to figure out your health insurance. And that is a huge annual payment of close to $8,000 per year. And that's something you're going to need to take into account unless you're going to do the barista FIRE, which I think is probably the most realistic option for most people. Now let's talk about wages of young people. Here is a graph that shows the wages of young college grads have been falling since 2000. When I came out of college, I was unable to find a job. Yes, it was in 2020 and no one was hiring. But by the time I did end up finding a job, I was working for $15 an hour, which is underneath the graph, which on average it says is $19.15 for a man. This goes along with wages that are pretty stagnant. Here's a graph that shows wage growth. The very high wage people are increasing their wages significantly, and the middle class, which are most likely the people that are going to be excited about something like a FIRE movement, have been relatively flat over the past 20 years. Then we look at the historical savings rate for Americans. You can see this spike during the pandemic as people were staying home and not spending money on some of the things that they were traditionally doing, like going out to eat, entertainment, travel, was only up to 35%. And considering you need to get up to 50%, we've never seen a historical savings rate that high. And now with the potential recession and the market conditions, we're seeing a savings rate of 2.3%, which is really tough. So when you look at the overall market conditions and you see how many people are struggling paying their bills, it doesn't make me super hopeful for people trying to use the FIRE movement, but it is possible that some people out there will be able to make it work. And then one of the other things that really jumps out to me has to do with housing. Housing is probably the biggest expense that you're ever going to have. And when you look at this graph that I'll put up right now that shows the percentage of income that people are paying to housing, you can see that more than 20% are spending more than 50% of their income on housing. When you're hoping to save 50% of your income, that is not a great number. So housing has really taken off in the total number of dollars that it costs to live, and that's really going to hamper people for the long term. Are people in the FIRE movement going to be able to buy a house, which has historically been the best way for Americans to build wealth? Probably not going to be able to save as much to do that because they need that money to live off of. So these are just some of the things that I'm worried about when people discuss going into the FIRE movement. Is it possible to do? Absolutely. I would love to be able to do it. I just don't think it's realistic. I think it would increase my daily stress when it comes to my finances, which are actually already pretty high if we're being honest. And it just worries me that people are putting themselves in a situation where they've put their whole 20s and 30s into saving as much as possible. They're missing out on a lot of opportunities, and even still they may be short when it comes to their savings goals. So those are just my thoughts overall. Let me know if you think if the FIRE movement is actually something that you've considered, and let me know if you think you would regret leaving the workforce early because it really limits some of the wealth building opportunities that you have out there. My name is Andy. If you'd like to see more videos from me, I'll put some on the screen right now, and if you'd like to subscribe, it's on the side of the screen right now so you don't miss future videos from me. Let me know additional topics you'd like me to discuss in future videos down below. I appreciate you watching the video all the way through, and if you made it, please hit that like button. I really appreciate it, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.